All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Carlos Carnicero Urabayen. I'm editor of Future is Blue, the weekly newsletter promoted by Agenda Pública and Funcas Europe. And today we're going to talk about Greece, and we're going to talk about the Greece experience with the bailouts 10 years ago, and how much that experience is having an impact on the crisis of COVID-19 and how Europeans are planning to fight that crisis. So I'm joined by two very experienced politicians and knowledgeable of what happened in Greece and what is happening now in the Eurozone. So that is Joaquin Almunia, a former vice president of the European Commission and currently chairman of FEP's think tank, and George Papakonstantinou, former finance minister of Greece and currently a professor at the European University Institute. So thank you both for joining, and perhaps the best way to start this conversation is if Joaquin, you could tell us about the report you just published about what happened in Greece. I understand that you're saying, I think, if I may, is Greece stayed in the Eurozone stayed together, there was financial stability achieved, but the costs, the social costs, were very high. Would you agree with that summary?
Yes, the summary of many pages and more than 1 year of work. But these were the main conclusions. We evaluated, on behalf of the ESM, I evaluated the two programs for financial assistance for Greece, starting with the EFSF program, so 2012, till the end of the ESM program and the year after the ESM program. So the evaluation concluded with the third quarter of last year. And of course, the general objectives to keep the integrity of the euro area, to protect financial stability both in Greece and in the euro area, to try to correct as much as possible the most important macroeconomic imbalances, and to organize the package of reforms that were needed to put the growth path of the Greek economy in a sustainable way, I think were achieved. But there are many considerations that shows in the report that the work was not concluded, that the solution of the deep Greek problems that we discovered in the previous decades is not yet achieved. That is a work in process. And now, without the strong surveillance of the troikas and of the institutions, now the most important element to sustain the Greek economy and the Greek society towards the future, I think, is the ownership of the Greek society and of the Greek political leaders, government and opposition, to continue the path of reforms and to not to get through the window what has been achieved in these very difficult years.
George, I think you are very well qualified to tell us about what happened in Greece. You were finance minister in the early years of the financial crisis. So I need to ask you, do you agree with Joaquin's assessment of what happened?
I think that the report that the ESM asked for and that Joaquin Almunia delivered is a very honest one. I think it actually touches on a lot of the problems, the deficiencies of the programs. It recognizes that they were necessary at the time, and they were absolutely necessary, that they avoided the worst outcomes, both for Greece and for the Eurozone, but they came with many mistakes and heavy costs. For example, it's clear, the report says there was insufficient attention to the underlying social needs of the Greek population. I think that's very clear in the inequality and poverty that we had. It is also, and that's explicitly mentioned in the report, the fact that fiscal consolidation did not prioritize the extent of fiscal consolidation was such that growth could not come back. I think that's also very clear in the report. Weak program design, poor prioritization, protracted decision-making processes in Europe. That's also in the report. These are things that we can clearly identify. And of course, on the Greek side, the issues of ownership, the underlying problems of the Greek society and the Greek institutions, some of which, as Joaquin said, are still with us. They have not been resolved. And partly, I think, this is a legacy of programs, whether we talk about the first, the second, or the third, that focused on the end results of the problems and not on the underlying fundamental problems themselves.
I think there's been a lot of it's widely perceived that the social costs were very high of those austerity years, particularly in Greece. But I wanted to ask you about how effective this program has been in terms of achieving reforms, in terms of seeing a more productive Greek economy, in terms of how agile was the Greek state to digest the funds and implement them in a smart way. I'm asking you, of course, thinking about what I will ask you after about the current situation and how prepared are member states to receive this kind of funds and implement them. So I want to maybe a short comment on, was Greece capable of managing well these funds and implementing real reforms, or there was room to do things better?
Well, from the point of view of the macroeconomic adjustment, it's obvious that the fiscal adjustment in terms of deficit or primary surplus was achieved with a very high cost, because the fiscal adjustment was very tough, even during the third program, with 3.5 or more in terms of percentage of GDP, the primary surplus, but the debt levels are still very high, but at the same time, the service of the debt every year is quite low by comparison with the stock of public debt still outstanding. In terms of reforms, labor market reform, for instance, was obviously done, but at the same time, product market reforms were not implemented at the same pace and in parallel with the labor market reforms. So the growth potential of the Greek economy is built on weaker bases than needed. And in the financial sector, for instance, in the banking sector, obviously the banks in Greece are now reasonably capitalized, but the level of non-performing loans is still very high. They are trying to reduce it, but it's still very high. The funding of the Greek economy, of the private sector of the Greek economy, is not sufficiently strong so as to encourage investors to invest there. And foreign investors are not still decided to go there, at least to go massively there, because they still think that some structural adjustments require more political will and more political support.
George, do you agree with those, with Joaquin's comments in terms of what was achieved in terms of reforms for the Greek state and the Greek economy?
I think it's important to remember that the creditors, the countries and the EU institutions had a very specific starting point, which was there was a very heavy moral hazard rhetoric on this whole exercise. This meant three things. One, fiscal took absolute priority, with the recession being much worse than it could have been. Two, when it came to structural reforms, which were already secondary to the fiscal, labor market reforms took precedence over product market reforms. This depressed further output because labor market reforms, you reduce nominal wages, but prices are not adjusted, therefore real wages go down. And third, debt restructuring was not prioritized, it took much later. So these three things combined were the impact of starting from this from a point of moral hazard. This is the result of this is that many reforms that could have happened earlier or better took a long time And some of them are still not finished. And this is why, and I completely agree on Joaquim on this, there's still a long way to go. But when we're talking about reforms, it's not just the classical product market reforms that we have in mind, it's also deeper institutional reforms which touch aspects such as the functioning of the state, the judicial system, the balance of the checks and balances that exist, which go beyond any kind of support program. And this is up to a national government, the Greek government in this particular instance, to push this forward. This is not something that one can expect your foreign creditors to come in and do for you.
Looking at what is happening now with the terrible COVID-19 crisis that I think, unfortunately, we haven't seen the effects of this crisis yet, because they're going to get worse. To what extent the Greece experience and those elements that you have mentioned before that could have been handled better are having an impact in today's discussions? And I'm thinking about, for instance, the reform word is taboo in some circles in southern member states. And there's, for instance, I'm thinking also about Italy. I think, Joaquin, I talked to you some months ago, and you were saying Italy has satanized the ESM and so on. So I wonder, how can we connect those elements, the experience in Greece, which was, as you described it very well, and the current dynamics that we're seeing today, if we're going to see bailouts needed in the next months? How would you connect those elements?
I think it's up to George to start to answer.
Okay,
this.
George.
All right, let's start. This is a very different situation. Not only the nature of the crisis, because you cannot blame countries now for having done the wrong things. Yes, you can blame them, of course, for not having stronger economies, but you cannot blame them for the crisis itself. Therefore, the moral hazard rhetoric cannot be as strong, and it cannot be driving the debate. And in fact, it has not, except in a couple of countries. That's the first element. The second is that policymakers have learned. So, for example, they've learned the cost of hesitation. Remember, in 2010, it took 2 years for the ECB to come out with a big bazooka. Yes, the ECB acted from the beginning, but in a big way, it did only after 2012. Here, it took a few weeks before the ECB came on the table and announced very, very strong measures. Similarly, it took a much longer time and much more of a protracted, a gradual process for the Commission and for the member states to come up to decisions back then. Now they've acted much faster, and they're breaking down taboos. They broke taboos back in 2010 as well. So there is a learning experience. And now, is it enough? That remains to be seen. I mean, we have a crisis which is deeper than the crisis we had in 2010 because it touches everyone. In 2010, initially it touched only 3 or 4 countries. There were systemic elements, but initially it was only a few countries. Now everyone is touched. If you look at the numbers, they're absolutely horrific. So the question, and the response at national and EU level is much bigger. Is it enough? That's a big question that is not easy to answer.
Okay, do you agree with those comments?
I fully agree with George. The reaction of the EU institutions, the Eurogroup for what it comes to the Euro area, the member states at the national level is quicker and is stronger than the reactions we remember from 2008 till 2012. So before the public debt crisis and during the 2 first years of the public debt crisis. Now the reactions, ECB, the Eurogroup, the European Council, member states are quicker. Let's see what happens with the proposals from the European Commission for the new generation package. I think it's absolutely needed to coordinate reactions at the EU Euro area level, because many member states of the EU or Euro area had not their own national resources needed. The coordination is of the essence, and this reaction will need to be answered at the national level with a sensible package of reforms, because the economies in the coming years after COVID will not function with the same way, with the same allocation of resources, with the same productivity levels in many sectors. So reforms are needed, and reforms of the different nature of the adjustments that were asked in 2008 or in 2010. And this required a very good cooperation between the national strategies and the EU Euro area strategy. So this is, from my point of view, for all the European countries, and in particular for the weaker economies in the EU or in the Euro area, the coordination between the EU level and the national level is absolutely needed. And hopefully this will be a lesson that will be learned by the political leaders. The first steps, the Franco-German agreement, the reaction from the European Commission side, the decisions adopted by the Eurogroup are correct. And now the question is how to complement these good initial reactions with a clear strategy, not for the coming year, but for the coming decade.
If I can add something to what Joaquin is saying here. In 2009, 2010, we also had the wrong diagnosis, because Greece was the first to come in the line of fire. We took this as being a fiscal tale, a fiscal problem, but it wasn't. The underlying problem was in the banking sector, because, and if Ireland, for example, had fallen first, maybe the whole evolution of the crisis could have been different. Now, policymakers are looking at it in a more accurate way and are understanding the roots of the crisis and are pointing the policy levers to in the right directions, maintaining liquidity immediately, making sure that you don't have massive unemployment happening, making sure that into the internal market rules in the beginning are loosened, but now they have to come back, because otherwise we're going to lose the integrity of the single market. So yes, there has been a learning process, but the fact that there are still voices that speak the language of 10 years ago, even if they're in only a couple of countries, and the fact that we still do not have the final decisions is worrying.
Yes, and
exactly.
in my view,
Sorry,
Carlos, in my view, there is one element now that still needs to be agreed at the EU level. That is the risk, in this case, not of huge imbalances in one country or in 2 or 3 countries of the periphery, but now is the risk of big distortions in the single market. That is a common good for everybody. So I agree that with the flexibilization of the state aid control, but I fear a lot the very asymmetric power to use national resources to support national companies or to build national champions in some member states. I fear that the divergences and the inequalities are not only a big challenges within our countries individually, but inequalities now at the EU level are a bigger risk than the one the EU as a whole felt in 2008 or in 2010. Now is a big challenge not to let the single market to be transformed into a machine of creating more inequalities.
I think it's a great point, because I think until now Germany has provided half of the funds that have been given to companies at this stage of the whole funds considering the whole EU. So it's really an issue. But I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned, I agree, I think we all agree this crisis is different compared to 10 years ago. The element of culpability, I think, is very different. But still, I think you pointed before to this, we have 4 member states, clearly 4, not Germany in this case, that took a very clear position supporting the Franco-German, the proposal that the Commission has presented in the last week. But we have still 4 member states that are not on board with the Commission plans and who are very much reluctant to, agree to the kind of very ambitious package that the Commission has presented. So maybe you could think of, I don't know, an argument maybe Joaquin mentioned one, to keep the single market together. That's a great argument to convince northern member states. But I wonder, how can we see unity, considering that this time is different, but still we don't see real unity in the.
Well, so I know that this minority of countries, the so-called frugals, are trying to stop the adoption of the package put forward by the European Commission. They consider that the grants included in this package, more than €500 billion, is not the way to tackle these challenges. They prefer loans, and they prefer to endorse the responsibility to the weaker parts of the EU single market. But on the other hand, the Germans believe the opposite. The Germans, many Germans believe that loans are not, should not be an element of this package, only grants, because they think if you offer loans to countries that are highly indebted, the situation at the end will be even worse. So let's see how this discussion is solved. I am confident that not in the first European Council today, but maybe in the second one in July, or maybe in the third one at the beginning of September, the agreement will be achieved. Probably not 100% of the elements put forward by the Commission, but I am confident that the final package will be good enough to consider that the EU was responding much better than in the previous crisis.
George, a final word. Do you share the cautious optimism of Joaquin in terms of seeing a deal and seeing those 4 member states aligning with the others?
I do, and this is because we should not underestimate the importance of the fundamental philosophical and structural shift which we're seeing in Germany at the moment. It is fundamental. And let's be honest, Germany has always been the anchor of the frugals in the past.
Yes.
With the anchor gone, there is no position of principle anymore. Now we're in a negotiating exercise on giving some elements that will allow these countries and their political leaders to go back and say that they got something out of this. But no fundamental breakdown that I can see. Because if there is a breakdown, at the end of the day, we will end up with a coalition of the willing. And if in the coalition of the willing you also have Germany, it is by far a suboptimal solution, but it is a solution. And then these other countries just are out of the loop.
All right, I think this was excellent. Thank you both, and we'll see what happens. And I will be glad to talk to you in the future as soon as we know more about the decisions that EU leaders are going to take in the next months and maybe weeks and maybe months. So thank you both, Joaquin Almunia, George Papakonstantinou. This was excellent. Thanks a lot, both.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Bye-bye, George.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.